again, Roland.
Hi, Renee.
It's just so wonderful to have you to interview with me this morning. And I really am so grateful because I just think that you're amazing and that your work is amazing. And it has really helped me. And actually, I referred a lot of your resources to some of my clients.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm really, really excited about this, very passionate about it. So yeah. And
Cool.
I just want to say, and I'd like for you to talk about your background just a little bit.
Sure. Well, I started quite early on working with people. And as you said, what happened before that is I dropped out of high school. I suffered or dealt with some depression and anxiety in those years, which led me to kind of search beyond my direct environment or safety and started to travel, started to meet more people. And also just to find, who I am or what's going on for me that contributed to that anxiety and depression. And that at some point it brought me to the point of, okay, what am I gonna kind of make a living with? And if I could, the understandings that I had, if I could translate that in doing something with people. So I started with body work. I started with studying some massage and osteopathic body work. I certified in craniosacral therapy and somatic emotional release, and then continued further studies in visceral manipulation. A lot of that work was focused on dealing with chronic pains, and I had practices where I started in Holland and then later on in Luxembourg, and I moved to Spain. I'm here about 6 years now. And probably in the last 10 years, I've really focused on working with post-traumatic stress or complex trauma only. After so many years of seeing how physical problems are a direct result of emotional issues that people keep in their bodies, for me, it was more, as I was working on the energetic physical part, I felt I was too much managing those symptoms rather than really resolving those issues. And so from there, I transitioned into working with the emotional issues. And then from there on, it just from one thing went into the other, working with more severe issues. So post-traumatic stress disorder and complex trauma. And that's where I am right now, working with these complexities, really.
Wow. And how do you see that a lot of people that you work with, can you see results? Can you see them getting better?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I can't really promise anybody when I start working with somebody if they're going to make a change, because they have to put in the work themselves. But if they're patient and persistent and are willing to do the work, a lot of change can come about, absolutely.
Yeah. So one thing that you work a lot with, and that is regulating this anxiety.
Right.
Can you talk just a little bit about how you work with that, regulating?
Right. I talk a lot about regulation and containment and processing of emotional residue. And not just for anxiety, but all the core emotions. So that's anxiety, sadness, and anger. And trauma, in essence, is being overwhelmed, feeling helpless, and having a sense of, or having lost a sense of control. And so as a therapist or in the work that we do, you want to go back to those places where you felt overwhelmed and bring a sense of containment to those emotions. And within that sense of containment, you're able to actually process those emotions. And so I think what often is missing with many approaches, or what I've seen why therapy fails, is that you might take people into that space where there is a release, but if there isn't sufficient containment, they're not able to fully regulate themselves. So there might be some shaking, there might be some crying, but if there isn't any cognitive context and understanding what happened, and if there isn't enough resilience to go into those very delicate, vulnerable places, then it might just be a release and the emotion builds up over time again, or you might re-traumatize or feel overwhelmed again by entering in those emotions. And so I'm quite adamant about building up containment in order for the nervous system to be able to regulate itself, and that there can be a sense of processing, a sense of transformation, or a sense of healthy release happening for the person.
And how, in a nutshell, because I know this is a process and it's something that you have to work with. It's not an overnight. It's nothing magical. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. But in a nutshell, how do you set up that containment?
It might really depend on the person and how he or she comes in.
Yeah.
And so there are people who are very intellectual, and there are people who are more emotionally inclined. So if a person who is more intellectually inclined, you might have to give a lot more cognitive understanding, because that resonates to their way of how their mind is kind of patterned. And so that gives for them a sense of safety, that you know what you're talking about, and they can start to trust you, have a relationship with you, and then they're allowed to show some of their emotional things. With somebody who is more emotional, you might have to slow them down, because they might go into their emotions too quick and then drown in those emotions. And so you might have to slow them down, bring them back to the body, or shift the attention to body parts that feel safer, or perhaps talk about a person that feels safe for them.
It's all about having a safe resource and
Providing
building on that.
safety and resource.
And building on that to be, to feel safe.
Right, exactly.
Right, right.
So sometimes there might be knowledge, sometimes there might be distraction, sometimes there might be bringing a safe person into the room, figuratively. Sometimes there might be a body part that feels safer to them. So when there's a lot of emotion on the chest, and you ask them initially if they can feel into that area. Once they get too activated, you might ask them to shift the attention perhaps to their legs or to their arms. And so that helps to regulate that energy charge that might be happening in a different area.
Right, wherever that area might be.
Yeah. So I think it's important when you deal with emotional issues to go in and out all the time, and not to stay too long with the emotion, not to be too ambitious as a therapist, to want to do too much work, because that can backfire. And so you want to take people in the emotion and then take people out again and talk about it rather than talk into it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Oh, wow, this is so fascinating to me, because I think it works. And it's wonderful for people who trust that process and who will be open to it to see what happens. Because as you said, you can't make any promises, but if people are open, if they're committed, and if they really practice it, the sky's the limit, right? In terms of their healing or feeling safe. Yeah. You know, there's one thing that you talk about in your work, which I really respect, and that is the fight, fight, freeze, and please. You know, a lot of times people don't talk about the please, but when I read that, I thought that makes so much sense. But yeah, if you don't mind talking about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, which part would you want to go into? Because all of them were big topics in themselves.
Right, and I keep saying nutshell because you're right. They're huge. How does flight and fright show up?
I think the fight flight is, like you said, people are a lot more used to those concepts that happens, and also to the feelings that go with them. So you get activated by a situation or a period in time that's overwhelming to you, and you either want to confront it or you want to run away from it. And I often use the analogy of the fight energy of a dog showing its teeth. Like, you confront it, you want to see if you can overpower it, or you run away from it. what happens with complex trauma, you get also the pleasing response that comes in at some point, and you often see combinations of the fight, flight, and please response. So you might start out with a fight response. So if there is some type of abuse, you might fight back first. Now, when that abuse continues for a long time and you see that that fight response is ineffective, you might start to submit to your abuser by trying to please your abuser. So it's often a combination of those survival responses. You might start out with a fight response, and then that morphs into a pleasing response in order to mitigate the stress that you feel at that moment and try to kind of move out of an abusive situation. But you can see that as you go from one survival response to another, it also becomes more complex. And this very often happens when a situation is drawn out, which happens in child abuse, childhood trauma in general. That's why I think the please response, and that's why I talk and write so much about the pleasing response, is so important to discuss when you talk about childhood trauma and child abuse, child neglect, because there's very often that pleasing response is present to some degree or the other.
You're right. That makes
And
so
then,
much sense.
And then the freeze response is the ultimate kind of survival response where you go into. Now, just to translate that in nervous system responses, the fight flight would be part of a sympathetic response, and the freeze response would be part of a parasympathetic response, so the vagus nerve response, while the fight flight is more activated by the brainstem and the amygdalas, mostly those parts of the brain structures, and then also the adrenal glands. So of course they're kicking in on a hormonal level. While the please response, I think bit by bit it comes more into mainstream consciousness, because I've seen what's his name, Peter
Levine? Peter
No,
Levine?
not Peter Levine.
Okay.
Peter Levine, he kind of put the fawn response together with the freeze response. And so he didn't really separate them. Stephen Porge, I think he was the first one who started to talk about the social engagement system.
The polyvagal, right.
Yeah, he started to talk about the social engagement system. And I would put the pleasing response on par with the social engagement system. I think the only difference that he made is that the social engagement system is only a positive response. And I would say it also has a negative side to it, where as you start to please, you lose part of your identity, you lose part of your self-worth, because you're focused, you're starting to adapt yourself to the outward environment, to people outside of yourself.
Right. And I see that makes so much sense about childhood abuse and the childhood trauma. Because what can a child do? What can a 4-year-old, 5-year-old do? After they, as you said in the beginning, it might start with a fight survival response, but after so long, it's like, what can I do? So let me start to survive. Let me start pleasing or doing what I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
I think it's important to emphasize that, because as an adult, as you have these responses, you might be quite hard on yourself. You bring in a lot of self-reproach of, why can't I be more assertive, or why didn't I act differently in this situation? But the moment you start to see that you didn't have a choice as a child, because you were exposed to this environment where you were under constant stress by very often a parent, when you become aware of that, that can also bring in some more compassion for yourself, that you didn't have a choice to act differently. And the moment you can move away from that self-reproach, you can start to meet those pleasing responses that you have that are part of you, and you can start to own and work with them. And the best way to, coming back to regulation, the best way to work with regulating, managing, and containing the please response is to bit by bit work with boundaries and reestablishing a healthy fight response, because it's a healthy fight response that gives back a sense of self-worth and self-esteem, and that helps to regulate an overly pleasing response and makes it a healthy empathy response.
Wow. Yeah. All makes so much sense.
Hmm.
Well, is there anything? I wanted this to be 30 minutes. Of course, I'm flexible, but is there anything else that you'd like to say to someone who might be listening to this?
Hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, feeling overwhelmed is part and parcel of dealing with post-traumatic stress. And I would say anxiety or even anger issues or narcissism or being sociopathic or dealing with depression, dealing with grief, they're all, the origin of it is some sense of having lost control, feeling helpless. And so then you come back to trauma, you come back to suffering from post-traumatic stress. And that can be a complex form when we talk about child abuse, or it can also be when you've gone through an accident or you've gone through a robbery. Those same processes are present. The same mechanisms are present. I think the difference is when you talk about childhood trauma, complex trauma, is that you might have different sets of those mechanisms. And so, and when we talk about mechanisms, you have being overwhelmed, having lost a sense of control. Then you have a core emotion of anger, fear, or sadness that make you feel overwhelmed. And then from there, when you dissociate further in complexity, you might suffer with addictions as a way of regulating your stress. You might suffer from excessive thoughts of blame, shame, guilt, embarrassment, pride, self-righteousness, shame, and etc. And then when that persists for too long, you might default to depression, chronic pains, fatigue, and exhaustion. So that's a kind of the basic set of how trauma works when it's unresolved and how it dissociates. Now, when you've gone through prolonged periods of trauma with various people or various incidences in your life, you have these kind of funnels, not just one of one incident, but you have kind of two or three main ones. So one relates to your mom, that maybe you fought first and then you defaulted into pleasing. And then to your dad or to your grandfather or to your brother, you might have another set of survival responses. You might not start with fight, but you might have started with trying to avoid or escape that person. And later on, you try to fight back, and later on, you froze. So with complex trauma, you very often have different subsets of kind of these dissociation patterns, which makes it a lot more complex to work with. And I think just as kind of closing thoughts, that you have to keep that in mind, that when you work with complex trauma, you might have different subsets of dissociation patterns depending on what situation or what person you're triggered by or what you've gone through.
Sorry, I'm just, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
It sounds like I could listen to you all day as you teach, because it all makes so much sense. And I think education is just key to really understanding this and seeing how to resolve it. How do you go about learning something different and how to self-regulate?
Mm.
Because it makes so much sense. And you know what? Before I really knew about this, I had no idea. I'm talking about when I was 19 years old, I
Mm.
had no idea what was going on. I
Mm.
knew what the patterns were, I could identify them, but I didn't know what that meant.
Right.
And I think someone like you, um, I think you're such a gift, because you've done a lot of research, you've done a lot of work, you've done a lot of experimenting, I would imagine, on all of this just to see how it works. And you know, the way you've summed it up, the way you've shared the information this morning, it's really, really awesome.
Okay.
So, okay, well, if someone wanted to contact you, just join your community or
Mm.
email you out of curiosity, or to
Right.
learn more, they can just contact you by going to rolandball.com?
And best way is the website. That's kind of the portal where they can find my resources, what I offer, and also how to get in touch with me directly.
So the website address is what?
That's my name,
Okay,
rolandball.com.
.com. Okay, I wanted
Yeah,
to make sure it was .com. Okay,
yeah.
all right, all right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so
You're
very
welcome.
much, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds
Okay,
good.
all right,
Okay,
thanks.
good, good.